It'll probably thank
Got
you,
it.
dear. Okay, are we all ready? Then let's
Yes.
get going with this fabulous pageant that we have planned for today. All right. Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome back to the Doctor Who Target Book Club, the podcast in which we undertake the wordy task of discussing in story order all the Doctor Who novelizations, because Logopolis, City of Words, etc., etc. You know the drill. My name is Tony Whitt, and today we have an equally wordy four-person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. It's probably louder than usual, in fact. There's our intermediate level casual fan who's seen several episodes and has not previously read any of the books we've read until this podcast. And this time it's the worthy Dalton Hughes. Hello, Dalton.
Hello.
And those of you looking at this on YouTube can see him now, as you used to be able to do.
It's me.
It's Dalton. And there's our semi-novice fan, one who's seen little to none of the original series and has not previously read any of the books except for the ones we've done for this podcast. And this time around, it's the wise and witty Alyson Fitch-Safreed. Hello, Alyson.
Hello.
And finally, we welcome back to the podcast our good friend, the co-host and producer of the podcasts Talking Trek to You and Beatles Stuffology, JG McQuarrie. Hello, JG.
Hello, thank you very much for having me back.
I'm glad to have you back. And as if that weren't special enough, we're recording today live as part of this weekend's festivities at Chicago TARDIS. So we have other people joining us and possibly more along the way, who knows. But if you weren't able to be here today, that's fine. We know you're here in spirit and that you're watching this video on YouTube, or you're listening to this on SoundCloud well after the fact. If you like what you're hearing and you like what you're seeing, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/CWTargetBC. Depending on the amount you give per month, you'll receive, among other possible goodies, mugs and t-shirts with our logos on them, just like giving the PBS, but not a Target book. Since we know you have so many of them, you store them in another universe to keep the entropy from getting at them. Just to say thank you for being willing to help us stay on the virtual air. And as usual, we'd like to thank our regular patrons, Bart Lammy, Rick Taylor, Toby Bengelsdorf, the Video Junkyard Podcast, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast, Hans Wax, Stephen Pickering, James Somnall, Dave Davis, Simon Painter, and Joseph Middleton Welling. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We, in fact, have Rick Taylor and Dave Davis with us today, which I'm very happy about. And also we have Jason Miller from the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I hope I got that name right, Jason, because you've been on the podcast before, and I want to make sure we get that right. All right. We also have our Goodreads discussion group where you, the listener, can discuss upcoming books and previous podcasts. You can find us there at tinyurl.com, Y7KMASPR. In fact, we expect you to. We finish our discussion of Tom Baker's final season as we discuss Christopher H. Bidmead's novelization of Logopolis. Without further ado, here are some fast facts. Doctor Who Logopolis, adapted by Christopher H. Bidmead from the script that aired from 2/28/81 to 3/21/81, published by Target Books in October 1982. As of this recording in November 2022, the title is currently out of print, but is available as an unabridged audiobook, 124 pages. As we said last time, there's a lot going on with this one. We get a brand new master in his first full appearance. In fact, here he be on the cover. We get not one, but two new companions. Nyssa joining Team TARDIS was one of the surprises. I was trying to keep quiet, though it occurs to me that Dalton may have been the only one for whom that was a surprise. Because Alyson saw Logopolis with me at Chicago TARDIS several years back, so she
It was
may
a
or may not remember.
surprise to me because I don't think I saw the whole thing. What I remembered were parts from the very beginning and the very end. I wonder if I saw maybe some kind of recap and then the final part.
We were watching the kind of MST3K-ish version that they do at Chicago TARDIS. So, and I remember that both of us were falling asleep because we'd just been watching Brighton Rock in the other room.
Possibly a cognitive deficiency. It was still a surprise to me.
I think that would have been. We get a new script editor with Anthony Root, though not for very long. And most importantly, we get a new doctor with the departure of Tom Baker. When we pick up recording our critiques of the books from next season after the new year, we'll go into more depth about the actresses who play Tegan and Nyssa, but not before talking about the new Doctor, of course, whoever he or she may be. Longtime fans will get that joke, because that's a joke that both Tom Baker and John Nathan Turner made at the time, though it's since become a reality, thank goodness. Instead, I want to take a few minutes to talk about Tom Baker. Before Tom Baker became the Fourth Doctor in 1974, Doctor Who's ratings were better than they'd been in the late 60s, but they still weren't earth-shattering. After he took over the lead, the ratings soared to levels that hadn't been seen since the height of Dalek mania in the 1960s. They shot back up into the 9 million viewers mark, which was unheard of for this show. While Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes both deserve due credit for transforming the show, the lion's share should go to Tom Baker. The show would also never have reached the soaring popularity it has around the world, but especially in the US, had it not been for Tom Baker. While there are some of us for whom John Pertwee was their first Doctor, a huge number of that earliest contingent of American Doctor Who fans will tell you that Tom Baker was their first and still their favorite, at least until that upstart David Tennant showed up and screwed up everything. I'm kidding, of course. I adore David Tennant, and I'm glad he's back again. Spoiler alert. A story featuring Tom Baker is a bit like the old adage about sex. Even when it's bad, it's still pretty good because Tom Baker's in it. Not the sex part, the story part. Mind you, that doesn't always come across on the page the same way it does on screen. Again, kind of like sex in that way, but I can honestly say that without Tom Baker, this podcast would not exist. And so I'm kind of wistful to be saying goodbye to Tom Baker for the duration of these podcasts, because he will not be appearing in a novelization again until, well, the 5 Doctors. And even then it's kind of, we'll talk about that when we get there. So yeah. Dramatic reading of the back cover. JG, we like to give this to the guests. So if you'd be willing to do the honors for us.
I'd be more than happy. I have my trusty copy of Logopolis standing by here, which sadly I have owned since 1982. I can only apologize for just how sad that sounds. Anyway, my finest reading voice. In theory, the TARDIS should be able to change its appearance to blend in unobtrusively wherever it happens to materialize. In practice, however, because of a fault in the chameleon circuit, it always looks like a police box, a minor inconvenience that the Doctor now hopes to correct. Fixing the mechanism involves a visit to Earth and then a trip to the planet Logopolis, normally a quiet little place that keeps itself to itself. But on this occasion, the meddling presence of the Doctor's archenemy, the Master, ensures the disruption of normality. And even the Master's horrified by the threat of total chaos he unintentionally precipitates, until he finds a way to turn the imminent destruction of the universe to his own advantage.
As he always do. Yes.
Because of course he can.
Because of course he can, because this is how he does. By the way, before we go into talking about first impressions, I picked this up at Chicago TARDIS this weekend. It is the, I think it's the Logopolis playset with the regenerated Doctor, Peter Davison, and Tom Baker's outfit, the Master's TARDIS, and an itty bitty little Logopolitan, who I'm sure I'll lose under a bookshelf at some point during his time in my house. So there we are. I don't know why I pulled that out. I just did. So JG, I want to start with you. What way back when you first saw the story or read the book? Let me ask you that. Did you see the story first or did you read the book first?
So I saw the story when it went out in 1980, because I am unspeakably old. And it knocked my little socks off. I'd never, ever seen anything like it. It was the most brilliant thing I think I'd ever seen in my life. It's still, I kind of want to say it's my favorite regeneration story. And I know it's supposed to be Caves of Androzani, but it's kind of Logopolis. I had just never seen anything, but this kind of heady mix of kind of metaphysics and actual physics and maths and computer science and all this stuff, just blew my tiny little 7-year-old mind. It was amazing. And that's why I know I've had this book since it was first published, because the second this novelization came out, I pounced on it like a cat and a dead mouse. I was all over this thing. I just couldn't get enough of it. It's the most wonderful, one of the most wonderful pieces of television I've ever seen. I adore the novelization. I basically, like, unapologetically begged you to come on this episode so that I could talk about it at some considerable length. And I'm thrilled to be able to be here and talk about it. I adore Logopolis beyond all hope, measure, and reason.
Fantastic. There was also a panel at Chicago TARDIS this weekend where it was focused on by itself. I think it was Larry Van Mersbergen who ran it. And it was a very interesting discussion. You're not the only one who thinks of this as their favorite regeneration story, even though mine's personally Caves of Androzani, but for reasons we'll go into when we get to that one. Dalton, what about you? What was your first impression when you got this?
Well, having just seen the Master kill Tremos, take his body, and leave Nyssa without a father, I was looking forward to seeing what this asshole was going to do next. Because we knew from you that this story as well was going to contain the Master, and clearly by the cover, he's going to play a large part in this. So yeah, basically kind of seeing him back to the height of his power with a normal body, not some decrepit, mummified shell of a being that he was the past couple stories we've had with him. Yeah, kind of interested to see where this was going to go. And also, yeah, knowing that this was going to be the last Tom Baker, the last Fourth Doctor story, wondering what that was going to entail, what horrible thing was going to happen to the Doctor to force his regeneration, which was similar to, was it Pertwee's Doctor that also fell?
Well, you remember Pertwee's Doctor falling, but he kind of bounced back from it.
Yeah,
David Tennant's Doctor fell.
Yeah, but so having, yes, memories of the Doctor having fallen and being put into various states of being, I guess. So yeah, kind of excited for this. It's a good way to end the season, I'll say.
Mm-hmm. This time he's fallen and he can't get up.
No, he can't.
No, he can't. Dave Davis in our chat says, sadly, some of the effects haven't fared well with time of repeated viewings. It did warrant repeated viewings, though. It does. In fact, it kind of holds up well. There are only a few bits of the story that drag when you're rewatching it. Alyson, how about you? What was your first impression of this?
Well, apropos of the story, I sort of had 3 different phases of reaction. So I didn't remember the title of the story, but I had seen, well, parts of it. Maybe I was shown the entire thing, but I was only conscious for parts of it. So like when people put costumes on cats and the cat tries to sort of wriggle out by rubbing its shoulders against the floor, any beloved story dealing with the Fourth Doctor, I kind of want to wriggle out of, because so many people bring such love and such expertise to the story that I'm very intimidated by being a novice, even though that's my whole job here. So I was interested in reading it, but intimidated by having to speak of it at all. Second phase was the title, Logopolis. I thought, are they seriously going to do like sci-fi Gospel of John? And the answer is yes, kind of. Mm-hmm. And then my impression of the actual cover was sort of a Photoshop of Roger Delgado overlaid with Ralph Fiennes, who would have been far too young for that at the time this came out.
Oh my God, it is.
Well, so once again, in my role as an ignorant person who has seen very little of the original series, I have weirdly formed some kind of attachment to the Roger Delgado portrayal of the Master, having only seen clips of it, maybe only one entire episode. I feel like in the novelizations, there's a strong sense of when it's somebody else, not my dad, not the real Master, not the original Master. So I actually haven't been interested in a Master story since the one that I knew was the last appearance of Roger Delgado. So
Okay.
looking at the cover, I thought, yeah, it's kind of the master, but kind of off and kind of wrong.
Interesting. Yeah, because he's definitely a different incarnation of the master, the same way the doctor goes into different incarnations, even though there is kind of a base masteriness to him, the same way that we talk of a doctor being a doctory doctor.
The basic mastery.
Yeah, something along those lines. What about our other participants, Jason, Dave, and Rick? What were your first impressions of this when you first saw it? I want to make this properly interactive.
So hi, this is Jason speaking, and I'm jumping ahead of my friend Rick because Rick is on mute at the moment. So apologies, Rick. This was my very first novelization, and I know on my show, Doctor Who Literature, I've talked a bit about how my very first books that I owned were Invasion of Time, Destiny of the Daleks, and Doctor Who and the Cybermen. But as I was just getting into the show at 11 years old, one of my school friends gave me a copy of Logopolis to read because I didn't understand the whole thing about regeneration and the Doctor changing leads. So he gave me this book during a free period in the 6th grade, and I read about 80 pages in less than an hour, and I was absolutely hooked. And the tragedy is I would have made it my very first purchase, but I didn't find a copy in the bookstore for months and months and months afterward. So it took me a while before I got to the end. This is consequently my favorite book, not only because I got to it first, but we'll talk about this later. The language in this book is deliciously rich, and Bidmead is a fantastic author. And I mean that in the highest sense of praise. This is a full novel, even though it's a short adaptation of a script. And if you ever listen to the Christopher H. Bidmead audiobook of this novelization and just close your eyes and listen to him sing the words at you, you will see exactly what I mean. Television Story is also one of my absolute favorites. And even though it's depressing and there's a lot of death and destruction, it's my comfort food. I'm always made happy when I watch the story on TV because of the acting and the music. I have a copy of Paddy Kingsland's isolated soundtrack. So I cannot praise Logopolis enough, and I'm very happy to be here on this recording today.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, Bidmead has a background in acting. So that's why he did the audiobook for this one. It's unusual. In fact, I think he is the only author of one of the of the novelizations to do an audiobook of their own work. And he's very good at it. You're right. He's extremely good. Dave says, I initially thought Ainley was a cheap Delgado copy. It took until his last appearance for me to like him. Yeah, I could see that. Oh, that's right, Jason, you're right. Barry Letts did it as well, because again, Barry Letts has had a background in acting. You're right. I completely forgot about that.
But I
I'm
will
not
say in
really
terms
someone-
of, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I was just going to say I'm not someone to listen to the audiobooks. Alyson, go ahead.
In terms of this being a sort of false master, if you will, in the minds of some of us, I like the way that's incorporated into the story, and that this master has literally stolen someone else's body.
Yeah.
And that sort of incorporates the discomfort in a way that worked for me.
Agreed. So what do we like about this novelization? What is so impressive about this novelization?
Everything is impressive about this novelization. It's so good. It's really interesting coming to it. Like the last couple of times I've been on this podcast, where you've been kind enough to invite me on, we've had a lot of Terrance Dicks, and you get used to Terrance Dicks's style and his kind of mode of writing. And I genuinely admire Terrance Dicks as a writer. He is one of the reasons that I became fascinated by literature. He's one of the reasons that I went on to get a degree in literature. He's absolutely pivotal, as he is in many Doctor Who fans of my age, in sort of promoting literacy and getting people interested in reading. It's when you come to something like this novelization, I think you really start to also come up against the limitations of Dicks as a writer, because there's I think of sort of this is going to sound ridiculously overblown, so I do apologize for that. But there's a sort of lovely kind of fluidity to the way that Christopher H. Bidmead writes. It's got this beautiful kind of rhythm to it that's very different from the kind of very, I guess, staccato kind of style of somebody like Terrence Dicks, who's kind of like, he's got his stock phrases, he bangs it out, dum dum dum, and he's very, very effective at that. But there's a liquidity to the way that I think Christopher H. Bidmead writes, and he's able to both capture the spirit of the TV show, but also really the essence of it as well. And I think that's why this is such an effective piece of writing. He really digs down into the core of what made Logopolis such a great piece of television in my eyes. And he's able to replicate it here, but he's also able to add stuff in without just doing huge chunks of rewriting. And that's an incredible skill. So yeah, TLDR, everything.
I completely agree. He has possibly got to be one of the best writers when it comes to transitioning from scene to scene, because he does. I'm trying to think of another writer who does it nearly as well, but talking about, Tegan did this. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, something else Tegan would have been interested in, what was happening to this character, except he doesn't do it nearly that shoddily as that example I just gave you. He's particularly good at, just as you said, the fluidity, the flow of it is just astonishing.
Yeah, his writing style in a way feels like that stereotypical Star Wars wipe, where they transition from planet to planet, but it's in word form. But it feels like that. It very much feels like you're just naturally transitioning to see what this other person is doing. So yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what else do we like about it? What are some of the things we like most about his writing that makes him stand out?
I think the vividness of it really manages to land. He's very good at choosing expressions which manage to encapsulate things that the TV show can't quite manage to do. I trust you'll excuse me if I briefly read something out which has been mentioned in the chat there, but Dave says better special effects. That's actually an interesting observation, because one of the passages I vividly remember from reading this book back when it was originally released in 1982 was the description of the monitor falling off a beam. And it's kind of like the way that it's written is sort of like the way that people are dusted in Infinity War. It's that kind of thing, but it's so imaginative for 1980, 1982 that you can't quite believe that he was able to pull off, and he does it in such a tiny number of words, just the way that the monitor sort of drifts down almost like a leaf and then just puffs away as soon as he hits the floor. And obviously there's no way the BBC could achieve that in 1980, and the effect that we get in the TV is good for what we could hope for. He just sort of fades out and then he's gone to nothing. And and both Tom Baker and Anthony Ainley really do play up the sheer horror of what it is they've just seen. But it's so much more effective on the page, and it's so much more effective because it's quiet. And that's the whole key to Logopolis. I think it's a quiet piece, and that piece of writing around the death of the monitor, for me, that's the perfect encapsulation of how Bidmead is able to capture that silence around the death of the universe. It's not a bang. It's not a whimper. It's even worse than that. It's just silence, and the monitor it's so easy to visualize that puff as he hits the floor. It's a beautiful piece of writing, incredibly effective, very, very evocative. And that to me is the key of why Bidmead is such a great writer.
I completely agree. In fact, the loudest thing about those sequences on Logopolis is Tegan. As you'd expect her to be.
But that's why we love Tegan. That's why we love her.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Infinity War, because I went to see that in the theater about 6 weeks after it came out, and I managed to actually not know how it ended. I didn't know that the heroes would lose. And it was a genuine shock to me. And in this story, I thought that there was effective use of the usual beats of, the countdown is going to stop at 3, etc., that it seems like the heroes lose in a way that we don't, it's not exactly the same as we usually see, where they are about to lose, all is lost, someone waves a hand, punches someone else in the face, it's all good. No, Logopolis is dead. Reality is disintegrating. And it's a point that we haven't gotten to in one of these stories before, unless it's on some planet that will then be abandoned by the end of the story.
Agreed. Agreed. Dalton, how about you?
Specifically Bidmead's writing, or just something else?
Or
that I like?
anything.
I think that the way that we get inside some of the characters' heads and kind of seeing how they're feeling is really effective. Particularly at the beginning when the Doctor's trying to get energy back for the TARDIS to kind of escape this gravity well that they're stuck in, and they come upon Romana's room, and Adric is just kind of horrified into silence, maybe not horrified, but just kind of the idea that they came upon Romana's room without him realizing it, and then seeing it, and it kind of reminding him of the loss of her, and them having to, completely get rid of it and destroy it to escape the situation that they're in. That was really effective. Tegan basically being a screaming banshee for most of the story, for good reason. I mean, she's basically thrown into a very unusual situation that for most of the story, she's only being explained bits and pieces when Adric has a chance to really get a word out to her. I just feel like getting inside people's heads and really seeing like the emotion from them is really effective. And including the Doctor, there's the part where he tells them that he never chose any of his companions, and that basically, they all happened upon him, and that they just need to leave. And even that to me felt like kind of sad, and it felt like a defense mechanism, a wall being put up to protect them, and not necessarily him being mean, but just doing that thing we've seen him do before, where he's having to be really cutting and biting and rude in a way to protect his companions.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen, this is something that I find that Bidmead does particularly well, especially with that sequence, that Adric sees through it and realizes why the Doctor's doing it. I have to say, I adore the way Bidmead writes the Fourth Doctor and Adric's relationship. Because I said this at the convention when we did the panel on this episode by itself, that on screen, Tom Baker's dislike and outright hatred for Matthew Waterhouse is palpable. You really can't see him acting past that dislike he has for his co-star, and Matthew Waterhouse, bless him, doesn't quite have the presence of mind yet to be able to act past it either, and his intimidation, Tom Baker, whereas on the page, you get a sense that the Doctor is really quite fond of Adric. We're even told that he doesn't mind Adric's constant questions. In fact, he enjoys them because he hasn't had a companion ask him this many questions before, and he enjoys it. You don't get that on screen at all. And that moment where Adric sees through it and realizes, oh, he's doing this to make the separation less painful. Shows how strong that relationship is, even as brief as it has been up to that point.
I think it's always interesting to see if the different writers like the companions, because they generally didn't develop the character. They're just handed the character to work with. And I thought it was interesting to see that Bidmead did seem to like both companions.
Agreed.
Tegan is one of the things I found irritating at first and then thought was terrific is that Tegan is having a separate adventure for most of the story.
Yes.
In a way that I thought was irritating and disjointed at first, until I saw how it was developing that she's portrayed as young in such a way that she can't possibly experience the same thing the Doctor is experiencing.
Mhm.
She's actually described at one point as a concrete thinker instead of an abstract thinker, as if it
Yes.
were a cognitive stage of development that obviously she's long past as a young adult. She's not a 3-year-old. But even though she literally experiences death of a sort in this story with Saint Vanessa, she just doesn't have the sort of gift or burden of experience so far to think of mortality in the same way that the Doctor does. And so even if she'd been experiencing all of the same events that he and Adric had the entire time, well, Adric is like this a bit as well, she still would be having a very different experience.
Mhm. True. GG, you were about to say something.
Yeah, well, it's 2 points to pick up on that, really. I think, firstly, Alyson, I completely agree with you, but that's why I love Tegan, because she's very rare in the classic show for being a companion who actually reacts the way that someone would in that situation. She's not a programmatic character. She doesn't just turn up and, yes, doctor, and she gets on with stuff. Like, she's bullshit and she's awkward and she's got a life which extends out beyond the TARDIS. In fact, I may have mentioned this the last time we spoke, I can't remember, but I think she's very much as a model for Rose as Ace is. She's the first companion that's got a real family. We meet 3 different aspects of her family, and her grandfather, her cousin, and her aunt. She's got a job that we actually see her do at some point, unlike, say, Sarah, for example. And she feels like a fully rounded human being in the way that almost none of the classic companions really do. Ace certainly does, but I think Tegan, yeah, is every bit a progenitor for Rose as Ace is, and that's why I love her. I love the fact that she's awkward and she really pisses people off during this story, and she's shrieky and she's like, I get why people are turned off by that, I really do, but it's exactly why I love her so much. And very much as a sidebar, why I was so thrilled she was back for Jodie's finale. Anyway, that's a separate story. The other thing I was going to say was, I think Christopher H. Bidmead might be the person who writes for Adric best.
Mhm.
I really think he captures the essence of Adric as the character should function, separate from both the kind of slightly contrived, pickpockety kind of Oliver Twisty kind of origin, which is just nonsense, and also separate from Matthew Waterhouse's performance. I don't mind Matthew Waterhouse's performance in season 18. Indeed, season 18 is my favorite season of Doctor Who, bar none, so it'd be a bit weird if I did criticize him. I think it goes very much downhill next season, but again, that's a separate story. But I think the way that Bidmead gets that, like that teacher pupil, almost father son kind of relationship that the Doctor and Adric have, comes across incredibly well on the page, and I just think that the way he's able to take what can come across as quite irritating on screen and find a way of channeling that into like that natural curiosity, that kind of boyish enthusiasm. And yeah, okay, sometimes he gets a wee bit carried away with themselves, but that's what young boys do. And that's the thing to remember about both Adric and Matthew Waterhouse. He's a young lad. He's got no experience of the world. He's got no experience of the universe beyond, the Starliner, and also some planet there was a vampire on, and some grey tower in the middle of bloody nowhere. Like, he's completely inexperienced. He doesn't get all these cues. And that scene with Adric coming across Romana's room, I think, is another lovely encapsulation. Again, I think that's better done in the novel than it is on screen, but it's a lovely encapsulation of the idea that he's used to permanence. Like, he spent his whole life in a fixed environment, even with Mistfall and all that kind of stuff in Alzarius. He's used to having a fixed environment. The idea that you could take Romana's room after she's gone and then also not only lose the person, but lose all reminders of her, that's not something that he's really meaningfully encountered before. I think that's a lovely little piece of characterization. And again, Bidmead's writing does such a good job of bringing that across in a way that the script doesn't. And I think, if we're being completely honest, Matthew Waterhouse at that point probably couldn't have managed either.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually saying at one of the panels that the problem that people tend to have with Adric isn't with Adric, but with Matthew Waterhouse. And someone else said, well, you have to bear in mind, he was a gay teenager in the 1980s. And I said, and so was I. So I understand what was going on with him, but that still doesn't excuse some of the things that he wasn't able to do quite at the time, and to my mind still can't if you listen to him on audio. But that's just me. Other thoughts, other things we like. Because there's so much to say about this book, to be honest.
I love the little fleshed out. Sorry, I'm just taking over now.
No, please do.
I really warned you that you would. Yeah, I should have warned you that this was a mistake.
That's why I wanted you to
separate.
have on. Wanted to have you
early
on.
on in the book. Best to get that the right way around. Early on in the book, I love the little fleshed out details that Bidmead gives, just to slightly add to the world building without pushing it too far. So like the fact that Aunt Vanessa gets described as a film buff because she's got that one line where she says, oh, you know, in the film, dear, they always use a jack under the car when she's talking to Tegan about changing the spare tire. She has that it's just a tiny little detail that just slightly expands the character on screen, and that just it's that classic kind of Robert Holmes thing. If you take one line and suddenly you get to see so much more of the character. It's such a tiny little detail, but he does that a lot during those kind of Tegan and Aunt Vanessa scenes. We get a little bit more again when Tegan is getting frustrated when she's running around in the TARDIS, and she starts to think of things that are kind of within her frame of reference. Even like that slightly clumsy line about the outback and how, you know, she worked on her father's farm and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's a bit clunky on screen, and dearly though I love her, it's not Janet Fielding's finest performance moment.
No.
But again, on page it comes across as so much more naturalistic because that's her frame of reference. That's how she does stuff. And Bidmead is really good at being able to capture that element on the page just using a couple of lines. I think that sort of familial relationship between Aunt Vanessa and Tegan comes across really, really well on the page as well. There's a good rapport on screen, but on the page it just reads, again, it's that fluidity, but it just reads so naturally. These are just two people who are in a family together and getting on with their life. Somebody's offered you a lift to your job. It all goes a bit wrong and then really wrong, but that's just like how families kind of get on, and they get frustrated with each other and annoyed that you can't keep a proper spare tire in the boot of your car or whatever, and all that stuff. It's just so naturalistic, and all that early stuff with Vanessa and Tegan feels like a real lived-in relationship, and it's great. He's so good at capturing that.
And it would have been very easy to characterize Tegan as just screeching and bossy, you know, telling Aunt Vanessa how to drive her own car, for example. And we have a lot more than that. I like that Aunt Vanessa is the one who's good at managing people. Like you said, you know, well, you know, in the films, don't they always put a jack under the car instead of "you idiot, you're going to be crushed" or something like that. And it's a way that Romana might have tried to manage the Doctor, and but it's a characterization of someone who's managing the person who's going to be the new companion. We get this idea that Tegan is going to have no idea how to manage the Doctor. She's too young, she's too green to have those kinds of techniques yet, and I like that.
Also going back to what we've said about the way Bidmead writes Aunt Vanessa, there's one moment that stands out reading this novelization to me this time, the fact that just before she dies, she lifts the car tire and is trying to throw it at the Master. And on screen, you notice it and you don't think anything of it. But here he actually writes, oh, in her panic and her adrenaline rush at being confronted with the horrifying visage of Anthony Ainley, apparently, she lifts this tire off the ground, which is way too heavy for her, and tries to throw it at him. And it's like, oh, yeah, you're right. That would not be something that would occur to me, not having seen it. So it's minor moments like that that stand out to me. And he's extremely good at those. Dalton, you look like you were about to say something.
I was just thinking about the way that we have basically for probably the first half of the book, we have two kind of unknown characters that are stalking people, or that we don't really know who they are. So we have the master who kills the police officer and kills Aunt Vanessa and kind of stalking around, and the TARDIS when Tegan's in there in the cloister. But then we also have the Watcher that when people are seeing him, they're also getting like weird feelings or kind of confused feelings and not quite knowing what they are. And it's feels like it's supposed to be kind of, is the Watcher the person that is doing this stuff, killing these people? Is this a benevolent person? I've caught on kind of early that this felt like something that I've seen in the new Doctor Who series, where there's an iteration that's the Doctor that's not the Doctor somehow, or there's a version of him, and also that the Doctor says that they've slipped into the future.
Yes. Yeah.
But I did enjoy that, where even though I caught on to it, how there was this like moment where you're not sure if that's the same character and what their motives and intentions are.
Mm-hmm. Bidmead does a huge amount of foreshadowing there. In fact, that's the sort of foreshadowing you don't necessarily get in the televised version. I don't know if JG will agree with me on that one, but I don't really see that foreshadowing in the TV version nearly as much as I see it on the page this time.
I do agree with that. I also want to kind of pick up on something that was said there, which is that I think Adric's confusion as to the Master Watcher kind of dichotomy comes across much better on the page as well. I mean, I love the televised Logopolis, just, you know, more than oxygen. But if I was to identify one tiny little flaw in it, is it probably is that Adric seems a bit thick, not realizing that the Watcher is the Master. Like that's meant to be his. I'm being as polite as I can. But that, you know, like the Watcher clearly isn't the Master, and you know all the kind of slightly indirect replies that the Doctor gives Adric when Adric asks about, especially after the meeting in the bridge. Just they seem slightly writerly contrivance to try and continue this idea that, well, we don't really know what the Watcher is, and he could be the Master, but we know he's not the Master. It's incredibly clear, and Adric is just thick when he doesn't realize it. But on the page, that actually comes across much better, I think, because the ambiguity around the character isn't overemphasized. You know, we don't have a, you know, slightly conspicuous and very tall dancer in papier-mâché waving at you from the other side of the road. That helps a little bit as well. But it's just Adric's understandable confusion is just very believable on the page. And again, I think that very much speaks to the strength of Bidmead as a writer. Whereas, yeah, on screen, there's the foreshadowing is it's mostly Tom Baker looking very distressed.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, Nyssa laughs at Adric on the page when he says, "Oh, that's the Master," and she says, "No, that's the Doctor's friend. That's the one who brought me here." But you would think that after hearing the Watcher talk to him and only remembering the Doctor speaking, he'd be like, "Oh, the reason I'm hearing the Doctor speaking is because it's the fucking Doctor." But no, he doesn't do that. Jason in the chat says the first line of the book is so gorgeous, it really leans into that foreshadowing. And I just want to read it out because it really does. The whole first paragraph, in fact: events cast shadows before them, but the huger shadows creep over us unseen. When some great circumstance, however, I'm fucking it up. When some great circumstance hovering somewhere in the future is a catastrophe of incalculable consequence, you may not see the signs and the small happenings that go before. The Doctor did, however, vaguely, which is a lovely, lovely, lovely opening. And Dave reminds us that we've had something of the Watcher before, which is something that I wanted to bring up too, because I wanted to talk about the Watcher and whether or not that plot device works the way it's supposed to, because we've had something similar to it in Planet of the Spiders with the Abbot and Choji. Except it wasn't. It was something much weirder there because they were coexistent as individuals in that particular version. And here the Watcher is, as you said, a tall dancer in paper mache waving from across the road. And it's very odd. So I was wondering how y'all felt about the Watcher as a plot device.
I think the Watcher, I mean, the Watcher in the bypass just looks like he's like cruising. That's the truth of the matter. But hello, Ducky. I think the fundamental difference between Choji and the Watcher is it's sort of encapsulated in the way the stories are constructed and what the stories are about. I mean, it's obvious to say about Planet of the Spiders that it's meant to be this kind of Buddhist parallel or Buddhist metaphor, which I suppose it is, and the Abbot and Choji certainly sort of fit into that. But the point of Planet of the Spiders is supposed to be the Doctor addressing his hubris and being cast down for his sin of greed when it comes to knowledge. And so in Buddhism and in so yin yang symbolism, then Choji is the balance against that. The Watcher is concerned with a story obsessed with decay and loss and entropy and the collapse of systems. So in that sense, he both is the same and different to Choji, I would say. He's the same in the sense that he's the way out of that collapsing system. The Third Doctor and his hubris is eventually allowed release through Choji. The Doctor dies in Planet of the Spider and Choji helps him regenerate. In this story, the Watcher is also the way out of the collapsed system of entropy. He's the way that the Doctor is able to move forward from the decay and the wasting, which has been following him for the entire season. It also gives a way forward for Doctor Who, sort of paratextually as a TV show, to escape the shadow of Tom Baker. So I think but the Watcher is also very different in a way as well, because he's not a specific encapsulation of that particular concept, whereas I think Choji is a very deliberate encapsulation of that. So there are similarities, but they're both an escape mechanism. I suppose in a way they're both charged vacuum emboitments. They're a way out of your closed system to escape the entropy which is closing in around you. And in the case of the Third Doctor, the way out is Tom Baker, and in the case of the Fourth Doctor, the way out is Peter Davison.
That's a very good way of looking at it. I also want to bring up the comments we've had in chat. Jason says that Choji was an intentional projection, the Watcher's accidental, a ghost from the future that catches the Doctor off guard, which is true. Yeah, that you get that idea that Choji is meant to be there and is intended, whereas the Watcher shouldn't be. Dave points out that the Abbot was better at it, like Romana was better at controlling regeneration. True, because the Doctor kind of sucks at anything having to do about this. And Jason also says there are two passages in the text that really explain the Watcher well. The very top of 118 and the single paragraph section on page 121. And thank you, by the way. I will say Jason Miller is one of the few guests we've ever had on the show that gives us page numbers, which I'm always appreciative of. Talked about the double doors were ajar, and in the opening loomed the vague outline of the figure that had followed him to Logopolis and back, something distinctly proprietorial about the patient way he waited in the TARDIS entrance sent a chill through the Doctor's body. And yeah, it's got that feel of that's exactly what's going on. And 121, I am looking for that pair. Oh yeah, I love this because it reminds me of Watchmen. From the door of the TARDIS, the Watcher had seen the Master retracing his steps to the computer room as he saw now the Doctor's perilous ascent on the Pharos antenna. These were the conditions of the moment he knew had to come. In his mind was a clock, its hands closing on the inevitable vertical of midnight, which is poeticus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Lovely,
It's
lovely.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
On a broader sort of subject, I really regret the fact that Christopher H. Bidmead hasn't written more.
Yes.
I obviously love Logopolis. I adore Castrovalva beyond, again, all sort of hope and reason. And I really, even if it's a little bit of a step down, like I love Frontius as well. And I wish he had written more. I think he's an incredible talent who never quite managed to come to fruition in the way that, say, a Philip Hinchcliffe or a Robert Holmes or someone like that did. He's just so good with words, and that's such an obvious thing to say about a quality writer, but that's what it is. He's got this great gift when it comes to being able to express himself, and I wish that he had contributed more to Doctor Who. Especially, I would have loved to have seen him write for the Sixth Doctor. That would have been incredible. That would just be glorious. But the fact that we've got 3 amazing stories out of him is kind of a blessing on its own. But yeah, he's such a good writer. I just desperately wish that he had been able to contribute more to the overall show. I don't want to describe him as marginal. I don't think you could describe anybody who's involved with Tom Baker's last season as being marginal, but he also sort of is as well. He's just one of those, he's so I mean, JNT overshadows almost everything. And then the loss of Tom Baker overshadows everything. And then the arrival of the new Doctor overshadows everything. Like, he does slightly get lost in the shuffle. And I think that's a real injustice. He's an amazingly talented writer. And I'm just going to have to stop gushing now.
Well, we're going to have you back on for Castrovalva if you're up for that in February.
Yes!
Because I know you specifically begged me for that as well. And definitely for Frontios, because Frontios, I have to say, and this is just looking ahead, but Frontios, I think I actually prefer to either of these 2 books, even though this time around, when I was a kid, I could not get through this book. For the same reason I could not get through David Whitaker's version of The Crusaders. The prose style was a little bit too expansive for me at that time. Whereas this time I took to it like a duck to water. It was just like, holy shit, how did I not know this book was this good for this long? It is just unparalleled in so many ways. I do want to talk about the newer characters though, because Dalton, Nyssa coming in was a surprise for you. It was kind of a surprise for Alyson because she forgot it. And that's understandable.
Well, but when I saw the episode previously, I wouldn't have had any context for who she was. I wouldn't have seen her before.
Okay, how do we feel about her inclusion in the story? Because in some ways, the Watcher, I hate to say this, if we're not looking at the Watcher as some sort of philosophical extension of the Doctor, he ends up in a plot device way being the only way that Nyssa can get into the story. Because the Doctor just doesn't have time to go to Traken and pick her up and bring her in with it. That's what the Watcher do. But in every other way, how do we feel about her inclusion and her being brought back? Because she's kind of a last minute addition. JNT took up her option as a companion during the filming of Keeper of Traken.
So much of the story is about the specter of death and loss that I thought she was there largely as a device to be a person who's just experienced it, who's already had this loss, and to show sort of the ache and desperation of it to make it a little more incarnate.
Yeah, she definitely felt like she was there to kind of maybe get some closure with understanding what happened to her father, but I don't know that I would have expected her to carry on past this. So yeah, it very, very much how seeing the Master realized in a full-bodied form with this story, she feels like a carryover from Keeper of Traken, and kind of wrapping up that story, but not necessarily something that is going to move us forward. Whereas Tegan feels very natural as like, okay, yeah, she's going to be a new companion because she's kind of happened upon the Doctor the way that we've seen some other companions, she kind of just falls into him. Whereas Nyssa felt very intentionally brought into the situation. Although now that I say that, so was Romana. So
Yeah,
yeah.
true. True.
It's fine. That's the best I'm gonna.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's not great. There's a slight clunkiness to it. There's a slight lack of elegance about it. But I think the question is also like, does it work? Yeah, it kind of works. It kind of gets away from it. I completely agree, by the way, by saying like it doesn't necessarily feel like she belongs in any stories after this. And I don't mean that as any disrespect to either Nessa or Sarah Sutton, but there's a logical conclusion that happens here that isn't then followed through in Castrovalva and the subsequent season. But I think there is so much going on in this story. I don't know how else you would get her in. I mean, you could argue, well, just don't. And that's a perfectly legitimate point of view as well. She's not necessary for this story per se. But if you have to find a way of shoehorning her in, it's fine, I guess. I don't know. It's a bit of a writerly contrivance, but that can only have been something that Christopher H. Bidmead just got landed with. I'm sure J&T just knocked on his door one day and said, "Oh, by the way, this is in your story." Oh, for fuck's sake.
He did.
Right, fine. Well, that's fine. Adric walked round the corner and found her. What do you want? And I said, okay, that'll do.
Well, I find that Bidmead handles it better on the page than he does on screen, because you're right.
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah.
Adric walks around the corner. There she is. The Watcher's off in the distance. Tegan says, "Who's Nissa?" And he says, "Oh, she's the friend we met on Traken," in this very kind of Scooby-Doo and the gang kind of way. And you see these two later best friends meeting in the background, kind of like, hi. And they get on with the story. But here it's handled a lot better. And her being used by the Master and then betrayed again by the Master, and her utter rage at it comes across on the page so much better here than it ever does on screen. And nothing against Sarah Sutton. Sarah Sutton doesn't do rage. She's not capable of delivering it. She kind of does it in the audio dramas because they finally unpack all of this stuff with her anger at the Master and her loss of her father in the audio dramas. But you're right, in the later episodes, it's barely mentioned, which is just ridiculous given how much of a tragic character she ends up being and could have been.
I mean, that's generally true of the companions here as well. I mean, Aunt Vanessa, to my rough guess, I think Aunt Vanessa is mentioned twice after Logopolis. Once in Enlightenment, where there's a picture of her in the room, and once in Power of the Doctor. That's it. Like, the Master gets like one offhanded comment about having seen a little of her aunt, and that's very funny.
Oh God.
It's the same gag the Doctor gets here.
Yes.
Oh yeah, well, I've seen a little of her. But that's it. That's the fact that her close family member has been murdered by this incredibly evil creature from another planet. It just never really comes up. And the fact that Nissa's father was murdered by the Master and then her entire planet is annihilated just never really comes up either. But that's not the fault of Logopolis. That's the fault of the subsequent stories that don't pick up on threads which are very clearly being laid down here. And I think, to the credit of Christopher H. Bidmead, I think that is deliberate. I think those threads aren't picked up on here, but he is intentionally leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, emotional breadcrumbs, if you will, to give to other writers who will then be able to come back to it, because both these characters suffer incredible trauma. They both go through, what ought to be an absolute ringer of a situation, and nobody picks up on it. That's not Logopolis's fault. It's not Christopher H. Bidmead's fault. And Tony, you're absolutely right that rage is not really Sarah Sutton's strongest point as an actor. But it's such a waste that nothing is ever really done with that until Big Finish come along.
Yeah, and the fact that sympathy is not Tom Baker's strong suit. So when he breaks the news,
that's an understatement.
Yeah, when he breaks the news of Auntie Vanessa's death, he's like, "Tegan, I'm so sorry," and he pushes her off into the corner to have a cry. Whereas on the
God.
page, it's ridiculous. I'll show you the scene at some point, but it's ridiculous. Whereas on the page, the doctor is like, I am so sorry. If there's anything I can do, I will avenge her. And it feels much more like the doctor actually cares. Whereas on screen, no, Tom Baker couldn't give a shit. He's going to be getting his paycheck and is going to be gone by the end of the day. Off to the barber to get his curls chopped off, which is exactly what he did after the story wrapped, so he wouldn't get recognized on the street. Jason says it's creepy in Time Flight when the master calls Nissa my child, which biologically she is, and Time Flight is written by Logopolis's director, which is probably one of the two only good things about Time Flight. No spoilers, but yeah, that's something we get to look forward to later on. God help us all. JG, you can be on that one too, if you like.
Oh, I'd love to. I'm never unhappy to have a conversation about plasmaton. I mean, I'm there for that. Absolutely.
Yes, because plasmatons, you just can't get away from them.
And your dishes are sparkly afterwards. So what else do you want?
God, where were we? We were talking about these characters not getting the wrap up later that they should, but they certainly get it here. And that's one of the really masterful things that Bidme does. I do want to quickly touch on the master here, because at the panel that we did about Logopolis, they said, what's one of the other things you like about this? And I said, this is the Anthony Ainley master at his least camp.
Oh.
He's still camp. He's always going to be camp. Dear God, is he camp. But this is his least camp. And Alyson, you said something about him looking like Roger Delgado on the cover. You're absolutely right. And this is the closest we get to a Delgado-esque master in this incarnation. The fact that he just willy-nilly kills anybody who comes across his path. He kills that first policeman simply because he can. He kills Aunt Vanessa
like
with exuberance. Yeah, he's absolutely into it and laughing the whole time. He kills Aunt Vanessa. He kills most of the Logopolitans. In fact,
giggles and cackles his way through the whole thing.
He cackles his way through the whole thing. And something on the page that he does that isn't in the televised version, when he almost kills the technician at the Pharos Project, when he goes back for his TARDIS, he goes ahead and kills him anyway.
Yeah.
And it's like, he's just vicious and a mad dog, the way you want to kind of put down. So I'm wondering how we feel about this iteration of the master in these early days.
Well, as I said, I was just saying, well, as I said earlier, he's an asshole. He just plain and simple. Like this is him just being petty as fuck, as the kids say, and just he does not care about anything but himself and his own survival and lording power over people. So
how do we feel about the doctor giving Adric some Milton and portraying the master as like literal Lucifer? Not literal, but like Lucifer.
That's new. That's on the page. And that wasn't in the televised version. And I have to admit, I love that bit.
Yeah.
I adore that idea of fobbing Adric off with Milton, and Adric being intelligent enough to understand it and to draw that parallel on his own. And it kind of works for me.
I think that's kind of what I meant earlier about the way that Bidmead kind of writes Adric better than anybody else does, because one of the most irritating things about his whole star for mathematical excellence is that, like, the only real indication we get that he's clever is occasionally the doctor will ask him to do a sum and then he can. It's that's kind of flat though, isn't it? Whereas at least getting him to appreciate literature, getting him to be able to understand the parallels between what he's reading and the situation he's stuck in, it demonstrates Adric's intelligence in a way that most writers just don't get. It goes kind of above and beyond the lazy cliche of, wow, he can do a sun dead quick. And that's such a lovely little additional detail to give a character like Adric. That's not the sort of attention that anyone's really given Adric.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm trying very desperately not to laugh at the phrase Adric can do sums dead quick, knowing what comes later. But
We're still supposed to
obviously
feel
that was
superior.
very intentional.
yeah, exactly. Alyson, go ahead.
Oh, I think we're still supposed to. Adric is still there for us to feel better than. I feel like he's reading poetry. He understands the story. He thinks there's a lot of wasted space on the page. I mean, maybe it's like a critique
Yes.
of the humanities education and his society of origin, but we're still supposed to feel like we're better than Adric. I do have a question about Adric. Does he
Yeah.
actually perform some kind of BMX trick on screen?
Oh my God.
No, he does not.
Oh, yeah, if only. How great would that be?
Isn't
Yeah.
that wonderful?
What is
Yeah,
the
go
deal
ahead.
with him climbing on top of the TARDIS and throwing a bike? What?
He does not do it on screen. And I think the reason why is because Bidmead, having Adric pretend to have a bike accident on screen and then pushing the bike into the policeman on his way into the TARDIS is a little clunky. Of course, climbing up on top of the TARDIS and throwing it at them like Hulk is a little clunkier in its own way, but
Oh
it
man, I
makes more
misread this. Yes, he does throw it. I thought he was like
no.
talking about the arch of the bike through the air. I thought he was riding it. I was going to say, is that on
No.
screen?
Oh god, that would be hilarious.
How did the insurer
Oh,
feel about
man.
it?
I would give anything to see. Oh my god,
Adric in the X Games, yes.
Adric in the X Games, because I'm sorry. One of the things I do like about Matthew Waterhouse is that the boy has buns of steel, so I could really handle seeing him on a bike. But anyway, sorry, that's terrible. He does not get on top of the TARDIS and toss it from there. Which makes more sense thematically and story-wise if you think about it, if only because why would Adric know what a bike is?
Yeah.
He wouldn't know to be able to say, help me, I've had an accident. It's like, no. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about Matthew.
We'll just leave you to your fantasies for the time being, shall we?
Oh, we'll get back to them
The
later.
special
So-
effects in my mind are always so much better. Although at one point I thought maybe Bitme was making fun of the effects on screen because he talks about Logopolis not having a lot of signs of life from the air, and I thought it was maybe a kind of a dig at them having a matte painting but not having the budget to do the little transparency where you have motion through it.
That's true. Logopolis doesn't have a lot of activity, and in fact, that
can't
aerial
afford
shot
activity.
does. It is rather static, but at least here we've got an explanation for it in story because they're all in their little hovel sweatshops, as Tegan puts it.
Yeah, it might be her first day on the job, but she's already been to, I think, the flight attendants union orientation.
I have to say, she really does kind of slide into things very smoothly once she gets over her pre-flight jitters, doesn't she? She's just like, oh, alien planet. Okay, I'm fine. I'm gonna talk to the manager now about how these workers are treated.
You know, air hostesses are trained in crisis management and how to respond to difficult situations. So let's assume that was a really clever, sly piece of characterization and just quietly move on.
It's too bad they didn't have
Yes.
an occasion to have her do an evacuation. My friend who was a flight attendant, they had to do these sort of war games to recertify every few years where you practice evacuating a 747, and she tries to evacuate Logopolis.
She kind of does something like that in Time Flight later,
Flight.
which is something I appreciate about that story. Again, maybe that's the third good thing about that story.
But it is a promising characterization that she's not going to only scream and be frightened. Yes, she's definitely going to do that, but she's also going to have curiosity and sense of adventure, and it is promising.
Yeah, I will say that about Tegan because I would not characterize her as a screaming companion.
Is she the actress who says we were all screamers, or is that someone else?
You're thinking you that's right. You saw Janet Fielding at the women's panel that year at Chicago TARDIS because you went without me.
Like I thought that was
And
like her signature thing that she says at all her appearances. Something like, "Make no mistake, we were all screamers."
yeah,
And being told
Uh,
that they were there for the, being told she was there for the dad.
there for the dads. Yeah, that's exactly what she says because Janet Fielding is one of the strongest feminist actresses to ever appear in classic Doctor Who. And so she was constantly pushing against that whole thing. We're there for the dads. We're there to scream. We're there to let our boobs out every once in a while, which was not her fault that it happened.
But she's the character's not written like that at all. I thought
Mm-mm.
in this adaptation,
No,
not written as a screamer, not
No.
written as just a pair of boobs and a uniform running around.
she is not. She is not. And a lot of that can be attributed to Janet Fielding pushing back. A lot of it can be attributed to the fact that this character just isn't characterized that way, which is really a blessing. Unfortunately, as we'll see in later stories, that more abrasive quality to her is going to get played up so often that Peter Davison loves Janet Fielding, not too fond of Tegan, I get the impression. Yeah, which is interesting because Tegan is to Peter Davison's Doctor what Jamie McCrimmon is to Patrick Troughton's Doctor. She's going to be there for almost every story, period. So get used to Tegan because you're going to see a lot of her. What else would we like to say about this book, either positive or negative?
I'd like to sort of look slightly back to what we were saying about the Master, which is I do think he is well characterized on the page here. Separated from Anthony Ainley's giggling lunatic of a performance, which I genuinely enjoy, but you know, I mean, ever since the Sea Devils, the Master's been a panto villain. So the fact that he's gone sort of full Widow Twanky in this is not really a demerit in my eyes. But separated from that, I do think he's a pretty effective kind of, especially the way that he kind of tortures Tegan in the cloisters. I think the way that he's taunting her and the way that he's just doing it for his own kind of kicks, I suppose, for because he can. I think that works really effectively. And that nastiness of the characterization, like Tony, you mentioned the fact that he goes back and kills that technician. It does help to give him an edge on the page, which is absent a little bit in the televised version. And particularly once we get towards the end of the story, when, how can I put this politely? Anthony Ainley fully embraces all aspects of the character, particularly in the control room, where lunatic no longer seems like an appropriate adjective. There has to be another word to describe whatever the hell he's doing there. It's not acting, but it's something. No. It's a presence. Whereas on the page, like the fact that the Master is trying to turn this whole situation to his advantage, it's not credible, but it works. And again, I think that's really just down to the skill of Bidmead as a writer. He's got this opportunity to make what is otherwise, you know, a plan to blackmail the entire universe with a cassette player kind of seem credible. And, you know, I mean, however good that would be for Sony's Walkman sales, it doesn't come across as wholly convincing on screen. But separated from that, there's a real credibility to the way that the Master is desperately grasping everything. And even although he's responsible for this situation, and that also comes across really well on the stage, like he almost feels guilty for what he's done, realizing that he has really gone too far this time, and yet still he can't help himself. Still there's an opportunity for him to control the CVE, and he'll jump in and take it. All that stuff is so well put together by Bidmead, and it lends it a credibility which, depending on your point of view and your attitude towards Anthony Ainley, might not quite be the case on screen.
Just picturing the Master holding a cassette player over his head and playing Peter Gabriel for the whole universe.
Come on, nobody's that evil.
No, not even Anthony Ainley.
No John Cusack.
Oh God.
When you
No one
have a
could be that
recurring
evil.
villain, I think it's important to not make them too much of like an old dear, too much of a sort of dark reflection of the hero to the point where you forget that they're evil. So you've got to re-up your wickedness, I think, periodically with the master.
I think so.
You can't develop too much of a nostalgic sheen.
Though, well, I don't want to say more about that, to be honest, because we're going to be seeing the master a couple more times before the end of this podcast.
Well, it almost feels like he's like course correcting for being nice to the doctor for the little bit that he is. So he's like,
Yes.
wait. No, I can't do that. After their predator handshake, let's be friends. And then he's like, wait, no, forget that.
Yeah, I'll say that definitely comes across on the page. Anything else you'd like to say about this one?
Well, the thing that like I said, we're talking about first impressions that I was not looking forward to is, oh gosh, we're going to do The Doctor is Jesus story, which I have a very low threshold of attention for. And which is exactly the story that was done when the master was brought, when David Tennant was the Doctor. It irritates me on a variety of levels. So I thought just from the title, that's what we're going to have. We're going to have something like in the beginning was the Doctor, and the Doctor was God, and something like that. Like I said, we're going to do whole Gospel of John with the Doctor. In the Doctor, we live and move and have our being. He upholds all things by the word of his power. I think some of that's Hebrews. And we did have that element almost word for word, just not with the Doctor. And that was a nice surprise. So we did have this concept of Logopolis, but it's not the Doctor. It's someone and something, rather, I should say, else. So related to that, the thing that I was not looking forward to going in, and indeed when I was first reading the story, was sort of a framework that this won't be a story. This will be a joint between stories. It'll just be a segue. It'll be just, a joint with no limb or trunk, sort of. Just sort of to not have too abrupt a break between doctors. We know we're going to have different companions, different doctors. We're just trying to write a transition here. And I think the way that was rescued, which I know might sound like too faint a praise to some, but is that the writer creates a story that's about liminal spaces, that's about voice, and often in a very physical way, like we've spoken of Romana's room. And a lot of times we spend a lot of time before wandering in the hallways of the TARDIS, but a particular way that we're wandering in the corridors of the TARDIS, the police box that sometimes appears to be the actual physical police box, sometimes our quote unquote TARDIS, sometimes the master's TARDIS, and then even Logopolis itself in a way that it's not in some kind of alternate dimension or reality. We're told explicitly it is the universe, the keystone to the universe. It's controlling the physical universe, but it's not separate from it as some other separate space. And I think we even had that description of the Doctor and Adric doing the sort of like recursive running of laps in and out of the control room.
Yes.
It seems identical every time, but we're told like the light is thicker, yellower, the temperature drops as they go through. And so what I expected to be the weakness of the story is it's just a transition between stories rather than a story in and of itself really became the strengths of sort of parking on that idea of being between spaces.
Yeah. And I could understand that because this is the middle story of a trilogy that is meant to introduce the concept of a new Doctor. We get Keeper of Traken, which it reintroduces the Master and introduces Nyssa. We get this one that introduces Tegan and reintroduces regeneration, I should say. And then we get the next story that introduces the new Doctor.
Well, and the trick is always when you recast the Doctor, you have to kill the Doctor. But it can't be fatal. And that's hard to do. So I thought it was an interesting story about bringing the sense of, they have to, in some sense, kill off Tom Baker on screen, but not fatally. but you have to have some sense of loss.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't know if when this aired, people knew it was coming. Would the viewing audience have known this was Tom Baker's first
Oh,
episode?
we knew this was
Okay.
coming. This was
Yeah.
this was big news on like the main news bulletins across the country. This was a well-known fact.
Gotcha. So
Yes.
I'm going to drop it through the floor tonally here and talk about the death of my mother earlier this year, and no one will be able to top that or undercut it. No, so I'm going to go a little dark here. So a lot of us have had more experience of death maybe in recent years than previously in life. So earlier in the year, my mom died after a couple of years of health problems. And even though this was significantly less serious, my cat died 10 years later after about 2 years of weirdly similar sort of health problems. And then a colleague of mine died a couple of days after that, but it was quite sudden. So in terms of the theme being not the doctor is Jesus, but the theme was entropy, the thing that resonated as I read it was it's the actual entropy sets in here is that there wasn't one thing, but a series of sort of breakdowns into calcifications of the universe as Logopolis died and failed to hold it together, and how that is often the experience of sort of natural death as opposed to things that are sudden or accidents or something like that. Is a lot of different things fail. You know ultimately what's coming. You don't know what's going to be the thing at the end. And so this, going back to our story here, it turned out to be not a story about, oh, well, the master is Lucifer and the doctor is the Logos. In fact, we had something a little, the master is Lucifer here, but not literally. And we have something a little different as the Logos. I thought a nice part here is when they decide to essentially euthanize the TARDIS. The
Mhm.
thing that they are planning for and afraid of anticipating is the water pressure coming in. And of course, that doesn't happen at all. They're going to drown the TARDIS in the Thames, and they don't quite manage to do it. They open the door, there's no water, etc. And the things that happen are the things that they didn't necessarily know ahead of time to be afraid of. They knew to be afraid, they planned for the wrong thing. And so that's not one individual thing so much as a buildup of different plot elements that I thought worked with the theme of entropy and a series of different kinds of cracks and fractures and breakdowns. And like I said, almost literal decalcification, because I'm thinking of my mom here, but also the descriptions of things like literally sort of breaking apart into dust towards the end here that work to coalesce both a sense of unpredictability and adventure, and we don't know precisely what's going to happen next in terms of the plot elements, but the overwhelming sense of doom of the doctor's not making it out of the story, or not this doctor that we know. Something will make it out. We don't know who or what. I think this is what didn't quite work with Nyssa, was trying to bring back this idea of finality of death with premise with her grief, and it didn't quite set up, I thought, in this story, but I thought that's what he was going for. And I think that's why I'll ultimately take away from this is that, yes, it's a transition between stories. Yes, it's about liminal spaces. We don't quite know what's going to happen, but we know exactly what's going to happen, but we don't know how we're going to get there. So that sort of messiness and lack of resolution is, I think, what worked for me in the end.
I think you also, in saying that, Alyson, redeemed one part of the story that has never worked for me, which is when you brought up the euthanization of the TARDIS, because the idea of dropping the TARDIS into the Thames and flushing the master out has got to be one of the most batshit crazy things that has ever come through the doctor's mind.
It seemed
even
pretty
in
weak. Let's
extremis.
just drown it in a few feet of water.
Yeah, exactly. The Thames of all places. And all because he didn't want them to have to swim too far to shore. But you're right, on the page, it comes across much more that this is them being willing to say goodbye to the TARDIS and strand themselves on Earth. And there's a finality to it. And it feels much more solid as a plot.
But then it doesn't happen
idea.
then. They're ready for it then. They are prepared for what actions they will
Right.
take. They're prepared to lose the TARDIS. They don't lose it then. They lose
Yes.
something else at a different time.
Right. And right after that, the Watcher shows up and has his conversation with the Doctor, verifying what the Doctor was fearing and saying, okay, this is what has to happen, because you imagine that's what that conversation was. It's the Doctor saying, I thought it was going to be this, and the Watcher saying, no, you've got to be ready for this, this, and this.
There's no false dread. There's just misplaced dread.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Anything else we want to say about this one?
We have to talk about the cloister bell.
Yes, we do.
Which is extremely
Yeah.
important. I've never told you about it before.
Yeah, because we've never heard it before, and luckily the Doctor says, by the way, if you ever have to get hold of me, use the cloister bell. Oh, there it is now. It's like, oh, for fuck's sake. It's one of those few things that even the best Doctor Who stories have this sort of necessity of plot where you get something introduced 2 seconds before you need it. And that's
Mhm.
kind of what happens with the cloister bell here. I assume that's why you brought it up, Dalton, because it is gonna, and it's not in a cloister, as Dave points out. It most definitely is not in a cloister.
We don't know that it's not in a cloister. We never see the cloister bell. It's just called a cloister bell. The Doctor hears it in a place that's not a cloister, but we don't know
That's
that
true.
the bell itself is not somewhere else in a TARDIS cloister.
Okay.
You had
Dave, is it-
material
is it in your
prepped for
place?
that. You anticipated that objection. We were ready to defend the honor
I think
of the
you
cloister
did.
bell.
Yeah, I just-
so
Big cloister bell is here for cloister
yeah, big
propaganda.
cloister bell Bevan here. Yeah, absolutely.
I
Big
just bring it up
news.
because it's something that I've seen and know from watching the new series.
Yes, you do.
So it being the first the first time that it's brought up, used as kind of a warning bell, it seems like important as a character, or as something within the Whoniverse.
Well, and it's in this story. I'm sorry to have to say it this way, but in this story, it also functions as a symbolic representation. It's literally for whom the bell tolls.
Yes,
That's the whole point. Ask, or if you prefer, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. The bell literally tolls for the Doctor in this story.
Yes.
I've always kind of liked that aspect about the cloister bell. I'm sorry, you probably weren't expecting to have a cloister bell fanboy in the show, but here we are. That's just the life we have to live. And I kind of almost wish that we hadn't ever had the cloister bell again, because it is something which is so unique to this story. Like Alyson, you said liminal spaces, and I think that's a brilliant description of the story. The story is all about liminal spaces, and Castrovalva will be so even more. It is about those transitions, and that bell, that tolling, that portent of doom is such a powerful presence within Logopolis. I think that does come across really well on the page as well, which is no mean achievement from Bidmead, but it's such a lovely kind of symbolic representation of what the Doctor is going to go through over the course of this story. And yeah, I kind of love its presence. Obviously, Tony, you're right. It's incredibly contrived. We've never heard of this thing. Here's this thing. That's lovely. But I do think it works within the context of the story. I think it's a really powerful presence that is just this constant reminder of dread and doom that this whole story is soaked in.
Well, and it
Yeah.
makes more sense now that you two have said that the audience would, when this was originally aired, would absolutely have known that Tom Baker was leaving.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
something terrible is going to happen. It's this baleful noise. How it's going to work out is still unknown, but that makes sense as a representation of, you're losing Tom Baker.
Yeah, and I think you're right, JG. It has been overused since, because it only, if I remember correctly, it only gets used one more time in the classic series, and that's Resurrection of the Daleks.
Correct.
And then it's very brief. It gets used in the TV movie, which is almost justified, but not quite. And then we get it in the new series, and it gets used quite a bit in the new series, but it's almost always when the TARDIS is in danger, and it's just a general danger, Will Robinson, warning kind of thing. And it was never meant to be quite that.
Yeah,
So,
less about the Doctor, more about the TARDIS.
yeah, exactly. Though at least in a couple of those cases, it's ringing when the master's doing something to it.
There's some kind
So
of
there
joke
is
in
that through
here
line.
about how this is why dinner is never served on the TARDIS because it's too terrifying to call people in. I can't quite form it, but there's something
Can't ring the
there.
dinner bell.
Yeah.
People think they're in the midst of a deathly situation. God. Anything else we want to say?
I have one last thing to say, and it's a
Mhm.
difference between the broadcast version and the book. The Fifth Doctor gets a line.
He does. He gets two of them, in fact.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
quite a surprising. I think that's quite a surprising change. It's the one thing I don't really approve of. I don't know.
agree.
I think it's a bit of a clunky way. It was I don't know how to end this. Oh, it's all different now. Yeah, I'm sure that'll do. Right? Okay, off down the pub, probably with Tom Baker. But I don't know. I don't really like the fact that the Fifth Doctor gets a line here.
Yeah, and it's a Monty Python reference. Peter Davison saying,
Yeah,
and
that
now for
doesn't
something
help.
completely different. Yeah, he does not get that line on screen. In fact, we don't hear Peter Davison actually speak until what, about 10 minutes into Castrovalva? Is that right? 5?
It's pretty far in, yeah.
When was this published relative to the air date of the episodes? Like 1 year later, 5 years later?
About a year later, because this was published in 1982 and the episode aired in end of 81, if I'm correct. Let me check my
End of
notes
80,
again.
I think.
End of 80, it might have been. It's in the fast facts.
So
February
the
through
audience
March of
for this
81.
book will have already seen the new Doctor then, right?
Yes, they
Okay.
will have. That's the other thing. Those last lines don't really track in the voice of Peter Davison, which is odd given that Bidby knows how to write Peter Davison. And he writes him particularly well in Castrovalva, and he writes him even better in Frontios, to my mind. But yeah, it's not in his voice. It doesn't sound like him yet. But that's fine because later on we'll have to talk about how Davison sounds. We have to talk about Davison, but not just yet. Not just yet. By the way, there was one other thing I wanted to address, and that's something that Dave brought up in the chat, and that was all the OCR mistakes. And unfortunately, since several of us are reading this in PDF format, those aren't OCR transcription errors. This book is particularly badly copy edited. It has some horrible errors to it, which is ironic given that Christopher H. Bidmead was a script editor. You would expect a script editor to be pretty good at editing his own manuscript, but not so much. And I think that's probably what happened with the target editors. They probably looked at it and said, oh, Bidmead was an editor. He knows what he's doing.
A script editor means that homophones aren't necessarily a problem. No, seriously, it's a different kind of editing than copy editing.
I agree. I completely agree. Anything else we'd like to say? Or shall we go to Goodreads?
Just one small thing is the
Yes.
Doctor being continually described as woolly.
As woolly. Oh yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's a good description. It
Yeah.
As are the
works.
fiber optic cables, aren't they? Are they also supposed
Yes,
to
they're
be woolly?
fine. They're yeah. For some reason, he's got fiber optics in the TARDIS. Yes, Jason, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I had wanted to talk about the scene where Adric is reading Paradise Lost in the corridor outside the console room. You guys have brought that up already, so that's cool. Just to do a quick comparison of the TV transcript versus the book. There's a lot of time spent on television running up and down corridors, particularly Tegan and Adric and Nyssa at various points in the story. And that's the sort of thing you need to do in a TV studio to pad out a 25-minute running time. That's endemic to the show, not a problem with Logopolis itself. What I like about the book is that Bidmead takes out all of that running through corridors and replaces it with original scenes, either stuff that he would have had in his original script that was cut or stuff that he invented for the book. So you have the moment where he and Adric go check on the TARDIS's logic circuits. And it's this big sort of fiberglass wig with lights running up and down each individual strand of hair, which, if you read the New Adventures in the 1990s, that pops up quite a bit. That was influential to a lot of future Doctor Who authors. And then, instead of Adric being shoved out into the corridor to stand there awkwardly while the Doctor is talking to Nyssa over the intercom, he's given a copy of John Milton's poetry, he's reading the book, and he's analyzing the text of the poem. That's all added value to the book that you're not getting on screen. As much as I like watching it on screen, it makes the book a much more richly textured experience. And one last thing is that Bidmead takes a lot of dialogue on TV and changes it from dialogue into expository text, which again frees him up for more interesting observational humor. So he's doing a lot more to adapt the TV transcript in making this into a proper book and not just a stale novelization. These are all reasons why it's probably one of my favorite books of all time, and not just favorite Doctor Who, but favorite books full stop.
Yeah, it's definitely not script to page, but the few times that it is, he is transmogrifying it or generating it even, we might say. I remember especially the Doctor's line about being an ignorant old doctor, in which he's talking to himself in the TARDIS when he says that. It's all internal to the Doctor, in the Doctor's head, and I appreciate that. I really do. So let's go to Goodreads. Let me pull that up as we always do. Let's go to goodreads.com for online reviews of the book written by other readers and follow up with our own ratings. By the way, if you're listening to this podcast and want to have your review featured when we get to an upcoming book, or you simply have a question about it, simply read the book, write a review, or comment in our Goodreads group by the deadline so that we have a chance to see it before discussing the book ourselves. You may just get your review read out loud here. The average rating for this book on Goodreads out of 5 stars is 3.70. The reviews from our Goodreads group have again been edited for length. Sorry,
I'm
everyone,
sorry,
but
Tony,
keep
what
them
was
coming.
what was the average?
3.70. 3.7. 3.70. All right, just making sure everybody heard it. In our Goodreads group, Dave Davis, who is here with us today, gives it 3 stars and says, I'm usually averse to mocking other people's spelling and grammar. I'm not, as when I do so, I invariably make a mistake myself. Same thing. I make exceptions, though, for demonstrably horrible people like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, who don't know any better, and for professional writers who should. I think Christopher H. Bidmead may have been an early adopter of word processing technology, as several of his mistakes are spell checker errors, where the word is spelt correctly, but it's the wrong word. Yes, there were several such errors, but 2 stood out for me. The one that always annoys me the most is the word lead, L-E-D. If it is spelled L-E-A-D, as Bidmead repeatedly does here, then it pertains to the metal or quality thereof. Otherwise, it is L-E-D. Bidmead uses the word leaden once correctly to describe heavy eyelids, but gets lead wrong every time. The other spell checker error I particularly noted, I found funny rather than annoying. It must have been very distracting for the Doctor as he climbed the Pharaoh's ladder to hear his coat bellowing behind him. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Despite this, and despite Bidmead being possibly a little petty in giving the last lines to the 5th Doctor, perhaps as a passive-aggressive act of revenge on Tom Baker, who had given him a bit of a hard time, this is a possibility. I quite enjoyed this book. I had found several of the special effects disappointing, so we're spared those. Logopolis, the place, was underwhelming too, as is much better represented in prose than on screen. Not a bad book, but a proofreader could have made it better. I completely agree with all of that. No, it's fine, Dave. You did perfectly fine. Craig gives it 3 stars and says the Doctor's longtime fellow Time Lord Nemesis the Master sets one of his evil plots in motion, which threatens the imminent destruction of creation. He never thought small in those days, and it's up to the Doctor to save the day. There's some science soup gobbledygook that's no more comprehensible to me in the book than it was on screen, but it ends with the Doctor triumphing but falling from a great height. The novel ends quite harshly and abruptly, with the fourth Doctor transforming into the fifth and then sitting up to deliver a Monty Python-like line. Well, that's the end of that, said a voice they had not heard before, but it's probably the beginning of something completely different. It was a pretty good story up to that point, but the passing of the torch should have been observed with little dignity. And finally, Charlotte gives it 2.5 stars and simply says, I enjoyed the first quarter and it was fun reading from a different Doctor's perspective and just fun in general reading a Doctor's story. However, it just suddenly dipped and I constantly found it hard to engage with and enjoy the story. I was also finding it hard to visualize and understand what was going on. So, JG, out of 5 stars, what would you give this particular one?
Well, that's a very good question. 5.
Goodness. Okay. And why?
I just love this. I don't want to pontificate again, but I just adore everything about this. Even that slightly misplaced last line, it's a bit wonky. Sometimes it's the imperfections that make things perfect. It's perfect. 5 stars.
Okay, that's fair. Dalton, out of 5 stars, what would you give this?
I'll go 3.5 for this one. Something that some of the other comments talked about, with kind of feeling lost in some of the wordiness of it. I enjoyed Christopher Bidmead's writing, but at points I was feeling like I was walking down these corridors and being just led astray. I don't think that all of the stuff that was added was necessarily needed. Yes, Jason, led astray. But I enjoyed the book. I think that just the story itself maybe had some weak points that could have been tightened up and edited away. But I feel like it was a good story for Tom Baker, the fourth Doctor, to end on. The Master was, again, an asshole, and I enjoyed him for that. So yeah, 3.5 for me, which is a little lower than some other ones I've done, but mostly just because I felt like this was a little bloated.
Okay. And Alyson?
I think the definitive quote I've got written down here is, I have never been susceptible to argument based on abstract nouns, Doctor. The Master touched the silver box and has released your grip. The Doctor responds, then come out into the streets and see what's happening. And that's definitely what the writer is going for here, taking these abstract nouns and putting them in an action story in a way that I both appreciate and admire and never quite comes together for me, but that's extremely subjective based on sort of the headspace that I was in when I was reading it as well. Some things I actually found very touching, obviously, about entropy and death, and then other things about what seemed to me like the overly fussy complexity of the plot and multiple Watchers and TARDISes just didn't come together for me. So keeping in mind that mob justice isn't really acceptable in this format, I'm going to go with 3. That was for JG. No. It's
all right, Alyson, I forgive you.
No, I skew low though. Also, I always skew very low on these, and I mean it in a quite positive way. So I actually admire tremendously what it is. What it is was never going to work for me. So that's a very personal, almost apologetic 3, if you will.
A 3 is pretty much a rave from Alyson. So
Yes, it is.
Well, but also another thing that can't be replicated is that sort of, for me, is that experience of having seen it when it aired and how exciting and intense it was. And the thing I've talked about before that was that exciting, intense for me episode in terms of what television could be was the premiere of Deep Space Nine. And there's nothing that could ever replicate for me part 2 of the pilot for Deep Space Nine, for example. So what this story, this novelization did for some people who experienced this episode as it first aired, couldn't be replicated for me, no matter how good the novelization was.
You can see that. Okay. And as for me, I'm not quite going to go quite as high as JG, but I am going to give it a 4.75, which is fairly high for me because this comes really damn close to what I think of as the pinnacle, no pun intended, of Doctor Who novelizations, which would be things like David Whitaker's Doctor Who and the Daleks, or something by Malcolm Hulke, or some of the better works of Ian Marter or The Gunfighters, which are all, in my mind, just about perfect books. This one comes really damn close because the story itself, it's like, yeah, it's sad and all. It's like, but it has certain bits that drag for me terribly. They don't drag for me in the book. There are things that are rehabilitated in the book. And this time, for the first time, probably in all the times I've tried to read this book, I not only finished it, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it immensely. And it actually makes me look forward to Castrovalva, which I normally do not look forward to because I don't like Castrovalva much.
I'm
As we will
very
see.
curious about it after all the Castrovalva talk we've heard in the last couple of hours.
Well,
Mhm.
as we will see when we get in February, when we come back in February with JG joining us on that one. There are things, yes, there are things about that one, but the book, I have a feeling after having read this, I think I may actually be a little more better predisposed towards the book this time. So 4.75. So thank you all. And thank you, fellow time travelers, for giving us your valuable time. I want to thank JG McQuarrie for joining us on this adventure, as it were.
Hey, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for responding to my abject begging and my absolute pathetic abasement to try and just get on this episode. I'm extremely grateful and it's been lovely. Thank you so much.
No problem. And we'll look forward to having you back in February when we do Castrovalva. I'd like to also thank our guests today who joined us live, which would be Dave Davis, Rick Taylor, and Jason Miller. Thank you all for being part of this with us. And next time
Thanks,
I'll
Tony.
make sure I have a working mic. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, fellow time travelers, for giving us your valuable time. Next time, we will have our Christmas special for 2022, which will be, I'm so sorry, the novelization of K9 and Company. We are doing K9 and Company because it is set during Christmas. It is, God help us all, in story order after the story and before Castrovalva, and it's just there to be done. And God slay me now. In the
It's
meantime,
a white elephant gift, Tony.
it really is a white elephant gift. It is the white elephant gift of all Doctor Who novelizations, even though I just found out there's a novelization of Dimensions in Time. And we are going to do it. And we'll probably have the author on because it's Jim Sangster. So I really want to do that one because I have a feeling he has literally made a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
You know, in certain jurisdictions, this could be categorized as attempted manslaughter.
It could be, but not here. In the meantime, if you've liked what you've heard here, like us on Facebook at Doctor Who Target Book Club Podcast, all in word with no spaces. Feel free to follow us on Twitter. For the meantime, we're at DW Target BC for now. And subscribe to us via the podcast provider of your choice. If all else fails you, and it inevitably will, email me directly at emperadolic@gmail.com with Target Book Club in the subject line so I don't ignore it. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and enjoy your travels. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 And we are out. There goes the audio file.
Should we
And
stop
I will
recording?
stop the recording. Yep. And I will stop the recording of the episode on Zoom.